Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Missouri Affordable and Open Educational Resources Symposium. My name is Jaleh Fazelian, and I am a co-chair of this year's symposium. I'm the Associate Dean of Libraries at the University of Missouri St. Louis. We are delighted to host the third annual Missouri A&OER Symposium for the state. I would like to take a minute to thank the other members of our planning committee, without whom we would not have been able to put on this conference. So a hearty thank you to Danielle King from the University of Missouri St. Louis, Sarah Fancher from Ozarks Technical Community College, Stephanie Hallam from Southeast Missouri State University, Scott Curtis from the University of Missouri Kansas City, Joe Askins from the University of Missouri Columbia, Jeanette Pierce from the University of Missouri Columbia, Tracy Stout from Missouri State University, Christina Verdon from Mobius Consortium, and Samantha Dickey, Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. And now I will turn things over to my co-chair.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Schmitz, and I am a co-chair of this year's symposium. I am the head of public services in the Thomas Jefferson Library at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and I am delighted to be a part of this conference as we discuss open educational resources and equal access to materials on college campuses.
We have presenters and attendees from across the United States and Canada with us to discuss issues surrounding the accessibility and equity of OER materials. We want to extend our sincere gratitude to the Midwest Higher Education Compact and the Mobius Consortium for sponsoring the 2021 symposium. Your feedback during and after this conference is important to us. Pop-ups will show up at the end of each session for you to give feedback on each session. And at the end of the conference, please take time to fill out the feedback forms that will be mailed to you so that we can gather feedback on the conference as a whole.
We invite you all to use the on-air conference platform to connect with your colleagues and fellow attendees. We want to assure everyone that the Missouri A&OER Symposium will provide a safe, welcoming, and inclusive environment for all symposium attendees to share their expertise. Please see the code of conduct on our conference webpage to report any problems.
Before we get the keynote started, a few logistical items that you need to know. There's live captioning available during this presentation. Please find the link located under the Handouts tab. This session will be recorded and provided within the event portal after the symposium. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation will also be provided under the Handouts tab. Please enter all questions into the live Q&A box. We will do our best to answer the questions as they are received. Actually, they will be answered at the end of the session. That's when Professor Roberts would like to tend to your questions. We encourage you to engage with us and other attendees through the discussion forum, and you can also post questions there as well. We will ask some polling questions throughout the session, and you will be able to participate with those under the polls tab. If you have any technical issues, the MEC staff are behind the scenes to provide support. Be sure to reach out through the live support button. And now we are pleased to introduce Professor Jasmine Roberts from the Ohio State University School of Communications as the keynote speaker for this year's symposium. Professor Roberts is a leader in the open education community and advocates for a more equitable system for disseminating affordable and open materials. Her presentation today is titled Open Education at the Center of the Margins of Social Justice. Thank you all for attending, and we will now turn things over to Professor Roberts.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? I don't know if I can I forgot I can't really see the audience. Well, if you cannot hear me okay, please put something in the chat so that we can get you to hear me. So thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's been a really humbling week so far. This is, of course, Open Ed Week, and I've been speaking to a lot of different folks and audiences, and I'm here to basically kind of spread the same message, right? How can we make sure that social justice is at the core of what we do in open education, and how do we still see social justice at the margins in terms of what we do in open education, specifically through an OER, open pedagogy lens? So I'm hoping this talk and the event in general will be very informative. And I'm, again, really, really happy to share this space with you. I'm in a good mood because it's sunny here in Columbus, and it hasn't been sunny in quite some time. But I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. Before I begin my address, I think it's really important to do a territory acknowledgement, even in this virtual environment. So I have a territory acknowledgement for the land that I'm currently living on in Ohio. And so those are the tribes who were the original or traditional stewards, I should say, in Ohio. I think, territory acknowledgements are really important to do, especially as we try to think in open ed, how can we decolonize our work? I think it's really interesting how, for example, again, I mentioned that I live in Columbus, Ohio. And I think it's really interesting how, even though this is Indigenous territory, that it has been renamed after a very brutal colonizer, of course, Christopher. So again, it's my hope that these type of native land acknowledgements will actually help in our country's, much needed path towards reconciliation with our very uncomfortable but real history. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be using Black and Indigenous scholarship, but I do want to acknowledge that I'm not extremely well versed, excuse me, in Indigenous thought, education, some of the issues or specific issues that Indigenous folks face in higher education. I'm more well versed in Black feminism and Black feminist scholarship. But I still think it's important to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing and elevate these examples, because I think it's a really critical contribution to what we're trying to do and accomplish in open ed. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so I also believe, sometimes that land acknowledgements can, I'm going to try to say this really nicely because I just did one. I sometimes think that land acknowledgements can come across a little performative, depending upon how it's done. I think there's a lot more that we can do within the universities or colleges, community colleges that we teach at and work at. I think there's a lot more that we can do to really reckon with how institutions, higher education institutions, still benefit to this day from the theft of Indigenous lands. And so what you see here on the slide is actually a project from journalist Tristan Awtown and historian Bobby Lee. And they spent the last 2 years really tracking down how 11 million acres of land were taken from, I think it was more than 250 Indigenous tribes and communities to help fund land grant institutions in the late 19th century. They talked about how specifically the Morrill Act in 1862 helped to, and they dubbed it as the massive transfer of wealth from Indigenous lands to university endowments. So in essence, the financial success of universities was paid by the expropriation of, Indigenous land and settler colonialism. And so on this slide, we can see how, for example, the University of Missouri in Columbia benefited from this expropriation. And so I think it's really important to connect Indigenous lands to the foundation of public universities beyond a mere territory acknowledgement. Next slide. And so I have a really quick question for you all. And I'm starting to ask this question more and more because I think it's very thought-provoking. How many of you all will be alive in the year 2111? So that's 2111. I don't think so, unless they create something that'll extend the life expectancy of human beings now. So oddly enough, that is actually the first year that Black and African Americans will be free longer than they have been enslaved, since they were taken from their homeland in West Africa way back in 1619. And so again, I just want to reinforce that our history is not as decent as we want to make it seem as though it is, and its modern legacies are obviously still alive and well today. And so this is why I actually do an acknowledgement that I am the descendant of an African people who were unfortunately enslaved. They were taken from their homeland to work on stolen land against their will. But I gain a lot of my tenacity and strength and determination from my ancestors, and so it's really important to me to acknowledge that I did not get here, the place that I'm in at this very minute, alone and by my own doing. And so again, I think this is a part of the social justice framework that I really seek to center in my work, not only in open education, but just who I am as an educator. And on this slide, there's a quote from Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the creator of the 1619 Project. And the 1619 Project, for those who are unaware, was a project from a couple of years ago, from the New York Times, that really basically seeks to reimagine national memory and add a more comprehensive historical lens to our country. So I really, like I said, do want to continue to do those type of acknowledgments in order to truly center social justice in everything that I do as a higher education professional. Next slide. So it's been about let me see, this is 2021. I can't believe it's 2021. It's been almost 5 years actually since I've seriously ventured into the open education field as a professor and higher education professional. I initially got into open ed, like many faculty members at my university. They were launching a program that sought, to incentivize faculty to adopt and or create OER through, again, a grant program. And I was one of the first, I was a part, of the pilot grant program there. And I guess, for lack of better words, I drink the Kool-Aid. I feel like I really found my community in academia, and the timing was so perfect, because it was during a time where I was starting to become very jaded of academia as a whole, and really questioning its utility and why we do the things that we do, and questioning traditions, policies, and procedures. And so when I found the open ed community, I was like, oh my gosh, I have found my people, because they're asking some of the same questions and doing some really, really good work. But a lot has changed in the past 5 years, a whole lot. And we have now entered into a very, very, very different realm in education. A painful realm or era for many of us. It's a time where we've really had to address our institutional trauma, our personal trauma, even. And it's really a time for us to, that calls for us at least to truly heal, right? And realize the promises of higher education. And so to that end, I think open ed is certainly dealing with some of the same issues, because of course open ed isn't operating in some sort of a vacuum. So in this talk, what I'd like to basically do is discuss how, the promise of open education, and that promise is that education should be affordable, accessible, inclusive, equitable to everyone. That promise should be relentless in its social justice approach. It needs to be at the core of that promise. And again, I know there are some open education advocates and supporters who are, doing the hard work in centering social justice in OER and open education, but we cannot shy away from that. Because again, the promise of open ed and OER is radical, because we unfortunately still live in a society that has structures in place that prevent the promise of open ed from truly, realizing. And also, just to put some things out there, I am approaching this talk from an educator standpoint. So my primary, first and foremost role is educator first. I teach, again, communication at The Ohio State University. So that is a vantage point that I am going to be, coming into this space with. So I'd like to go ahead and go through my pedagogical approach. But before I do that, there are actually a few polls that are going to be coming your way. And the first poll is just so that I get a good indication of who I'm speaking to. And then the second one is more so like, what's your general awareness of OER and open education? So again, you should be seeing those polls here coming up in a little bit. And so I'll be quiet for a little bit so that you all can respond to those polls. All right, we'll give folks maybe a few more seconds to respond to. I'm not sure if both polls are showing on your end. Okay, so we have the results from the first poll, and we have almost half of folks in attendance are faculty and or educators. That makes me so happy. That means I'm speaking to my family. Definitely know what you all, my educators, are going through or have been going through for the past year. That's excellent. And then I'm not sure if we have the results from the second poll. I can't remember whether or not they're showing back to back. Okay, so that's awesome. 60% of folks have heard of OER. There's some folks who have never heard of OER, open education. About a third are OER super advocates, superstars. So that's awesome. Okay, that was very, very helpful. Like I said, I really like knowing, who I'm speaking to in order to really come up with examples that are going to truly resonate with you all. So now I'd like to go ahead and go to my pedagogical approach, just so that you all know the vantage point that I'm using. So on the slide there, it says human first. So that is non-negotiable. I really try to bring my full self into the classroom, and I'll go into that in a lot more detail in just a second in terms of how I believe that is also a social justice act. And then in terms of my, I guess you can say my scholarship vantage point, so I'm coming very much from a Black, queer, intersectional feminist standpoint. And I use that to really inform my social justice framework that I try to incorporate in my classroom. And speaking of social justice frameworks, that is also a big part of my teaching philosophy. How can I encourage students to question systems of power and oppression, and not just in lieu of, politics, for example? How do I do that in my specific classroom or in my specific discipline? Okay. And then there is an educator or education approach, called the warm demander approach that I heard about 5 years ago. And I was like, oh man, that's basically what I'm already doing. And so it's this notion that, the educator is truly the coach or the guide in this process, this learning process. They serve as just that, and that the classroom should be created with high expectations, but of course, empathetic expectations for students, depending upon what they're going through. And I just wanted to point out that that warm demander approach does have Indigenous roots as well. All right, so now that I've put my approach out there and teaching philosophy, I'd like to go ahead and go on to the next slide and kind of talk about where we're at, with open education and OER and all of that. So, we really have to pivot and re-examine the role of OER and the role that it specifically plays in the COVID-19 era. And I would say that it plays probably even more important role in terms of course, affordability and accessibility. But of course, let's not stop there, because we have to remember in this conversation about education more broadly and higher ed, that OER is a tool. It's not a means, it's a means to an end, excuse me. It's not the end. And so how can we use open education and OER to truly advocate for social justice in academia and higher ed more broadly? So let's begin by talking about how COVID, of course, has fundamentally changed how we imagine education and our role in this system. It has really revealed and, in fact, exasperated inequities that, again, to be quite honest with you, we should have addressed more intentionally before. And so this leads me to a few questions that you may or may not see there on the slide. It's a little fuzzy on my end, but that's okay. I already know what the questions are. And I want us to really think about these questions, and that is, how does open education look during a nationwide, racial awakening or reckoning, depending upon how you look at it, in light of what the events that took place last year, summer 2020. How and what does open education look like during the COVID-19 era, of course? What are some promises that we need to revisit, and what should take priority now in open education that did not before? And so for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm not going to speak explicitly about the intersection between open ed and social justice, but rather I'm going to argue how leading with radical empathy and humanity is a social justice act, and how we need to incorporate that into our open practices, into our framework within open education. And even outside of open education, we need that in traditions, policies, and procedures in higher education. And then for the remaining time, I would speak more specifically about how can we actually do social justice labor, and what that looks like in the realm of open education, open practices. So to lead with that last question, what now takes priority in open education? I think if we seriously consider that, and if we want to improve in open ed, we have to talk about mental health. Okay. And I know that sounds like, whoa, she's talking about mental health now. I came here to talk about education in OERs. But if we can go to the next slides here, we have to talk about it, because there's so much isolation and depression and anxiety going on inside and outside of higher ed, more than it previously has because of the pandemic. And speaking of the pandemic, I really think that it shouldn't take a global pandemic like COVID to really sympathize with the modern legacies of systemic racism, for example, or to see our students, our faculty, our staff as human. So, overall, when I think about like what takes priority in open ed and how can we do that, one very simple way is to approach things from a mental health standpoint. And so for my educators in the room, which is 42% of us, what does that look like? For me as an educator and someone who, thinks a lot about open education, this means, teaching with mental health in mind. And I think this moment that we're living in right now provides us with a great opportunity to create a culture of wellness with students, right? And not on them. And I think creating that culture of wellness with students will help them to go down that path towards, academic success, or at least help to lead to pathways for academic success. That's what I'm trying to say. Instead of us assuming that we know what's best for them. And so this for me is expressed by, for example, teaching with empathy, which is a fundamental part of my teaching philosophy, excuse me. And I think, if we're talking about how to address wellness as a pathway for academic success, one way I accomplish that is by designing my class and curriculum with mental health in mind. I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about OERs is that we can potentially address this by the nature of OERs. The fact that many, not all, but many are designed with cost savings in mind and, accessibility to a certain degree, depending upon the OERs that we're discussing. And so I do wonder, for example, what kind of messages are we sending students psychologically when we assign them a $75 textbook or a $175 textbook? And what I mean by what kind of messages is, what kind of messages are we sending to students in terms of like who belongs in the classroom because they can afford the materials or they have access to the materials? And as a result, what kind of messages are we sending to students who cannot afford the materials and or cannot access those materials? So in this moment, I think economic accessibility that often comes with OER is particularly important, again, during this time. And, I really appreciate that there are more faculty who are interested in OER. Of course, this makes me really, really excited. So overall, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, we need to be keeping this in mind as we are connecting with our students in terms of the messages that we send to our students through our course materials, because we send them a lot of messages, whether or not it's intentional. And so I'm just wondering, why add the enhanced stress to students by assigning materials that they cannot afford, materials that are not inclusive, not culturally relevant or responsive? That is certainly not leading with empathy. And, again, continue this conversation about mental health and open education and higher ed in general. Another way that I teach with mental health in mind is, I talk about my own mental health journey and how I have been, in therapy for the past 14 years and how it's been, an amazing experience, very challenging. And the reason why I do this is, again, for two reasons. One, it humanizes me in front of my students. They're able to connect with me on a more meaningful level. And when I get to the point in my syllabus where I'm talking about mental health resources or just in general wellness resources that are available to my students, they are more inclined to take advantage of those resources because they're kind of thinking to themselves, well, my professor's doing the same thing, right? She's trying to maintain her overall wellness and mental health. So that's what I mean by leading and teaching with empathy. I think sometimes as faculty, we we have an image of what a professor, what a faculty member is supposed to look like, right? Or supposed to behave. But our students are really yearning for human connection, just like faculty are. So I encourage, the educators and faculty who are listening, to lead and teach with empathy. And I get it. We have to get through the content. We have to create classroom conditions that are conducive to our students' wellness while managing our own wellness. That is a lot. That is a whole lot. But I think, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Sorry, I forgot to say that. I think one thing to keep in mind is, with balancing all of that is that, I say this very, very often, is that we are teaching students and not content. This applies in an in-person and online learning environment. The condition of the classroom does not change this notion, right? We're teaching students and not content. And what I more specifically mean by that is that, the content, it's not the content that we need to keep in mind first and foremost. It's our students' wellness that we need to keep in mind first and foremost, our wellness in mind. Students will remember that more. Will remember that more about your class. That's what I'm trying to say, and who you are as a professor, rather than the content that you covered. I guarantee you. Students are not just these knowledge buckets where we, just put all this content into and all of that. They're people at the end of the day, just like faculty. I create a classroom environment where all of my students can really show up as their full selves, but especially students who are coming from marginalized backgrounds, because unfortunately they don't get those opportunities for a variety of reasons. So I think the most powerful way that I can create a pathway to, or for academic success for my students, is again by bringing my full self to the classroom, placing more of an emphasis on that human connection, because that provides a space for my students to feel like they have autonomy and agency that they should have, right? As opposed to, I just got to get through this content, because the content will come in some form or fashion. We'll get through it. But radical empathy, you'll hear me say that a lot as well during this talk. Radical empathy for students and faculty cannot, nor should it wait. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. I've talked a great deal about, leading with mental health in mind, teaching with empathy and all of that. And the reason why I do that so much is that, again, it is a huge part of who I am as an educator, as a scholar. But this human approach centered on wellness and healing is a social justice act. It is a direct act of resistance against a world and a society that, quite frankly, is determined to dehumanize me as a Black woman. And this dehumanization is nothing new, unfortunately, especially in the Western context, because we do have a very painful, shameful history of this type of treatment towards people of color in order to justify oppressive measures and systems. And I'm trying to figure out how I can say this so that I'm clear. Just a friendly reminder, when you ask someone to share their experiences of oppression, when you ask them to educate you about their oppressive identities, I don't want to say it like that, but just their oppression, right? How they experience oppression in this country, and you do nothing about it in some shape or form, that is reinforcing oppression, right? So again, what I'm emphasizing here is that I've seen a lot of folks ask folks with various marginalized identities to educate them about their trauma, about their oppression, but there's no action that follow ups with it. And you know, the action doesn't have to be dismantling a whole entire system overnight, right? Because it took hundreds of years to build the current systems that we are still dealing with. But to not take some minor action after you've asked someone to share their story in reference to oppression is an act of oppression. Oppressed people, unless they, you know, volunteer or are willing to do so. And I want to emphasize that as well, because there are some folks who are, you know, volunteering to share their story. But you shouldn't assume that it is the responsibility of those who are oppressed to educate you, or that's their responsibility to educate you, especially if you're benefiting from oppressive systems. There's an abundance of scholarship that, you know, as stakeholders in higher ed, we have access to that addresses how to engage in anti-racism and social justice labor in the academy. Read it, learn from it, allow it to truly enrich your research and your teaching so that you can be a better scholar and you can be a better educator. I have to understand whiteness in order to survive within and outside of the academy. And what I mean by whiteness is the culture that prioritize whiteness, right? And so the least that one can do is truly engage in scholarships and scholarship, excuse me, and resources that help to teach folks how to engage in this type of labor appropriately. And so I just want to reiterate, I'm engaging in activism and social justice to survive and in an equitable society, and that includes academia and higher education. And I'm going to take it a step further and make it relevant, again, to ask someone, for example, what it means to be the only student of color in their class or the only faculty member of color in the department, to ask them for their opinions about these issues as it relates to like race or gender or things of that sort, and not do anything about it on a very practical level, is very negligent, right? It's you're basically asking someone to share their trauma while not handling their story with care. And so I believe if you take someone's humanity seriously, there will be some form of action. Doesn't have to be major. If it is, great, but there will be some form of action that you can, you know, take up within your realm of self-efficacy behind this. All right, next slide. So over the summer, I voluntarily wrote an article along that note. You all know last summer in the US, at least, because I understand that I might be speaking to folks internationally. It's a very, very, very tough summer when we're talking about race in the United States. The murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, those are just the three that were highlighted on a very, you know, high profile level. There have been hundreds of Black Americans who share that same trauma, share that same experience, unfortunately. But this moment was very different because many of us were at home, or the pandemic seemed to slow things down in the US. And for once, it seemed like people were actually paying attention to these very traumatic stories of racial discrimination and injustices that have long plagued our country. And I had a lot of my white colleagues ask me, well, what can I do? What can I do to support? Blah, blah, blah. And to be honest with you, it became very overwhelming. It truly did, because I couldn't just be a person during the pandemic. I had to be a Black woman. I had to, quote unquote, educate folks on racial trauma, or at least that was assumed that was my role. And it got to the point where, again, I got very, very overwhelmed. And so I just decided to write, again, I voluntarily, nobody asked me to do this. I voluntarily wrote an article explaining what specifically white people can do to address white supremacy in academia. They're very practical tips. I do encourage you all, I'm not trying to like do a shameless plug or pub or anything like that, but I do encourage you to read it because there are some very practical tips. Another thing that I hear a lot from folks is that, oh, It just seems like it's going to take so long. And, I don't know what I can do in the immediate future. Well, one thing to keep in mind, and I'm using the words from Michelle Alexander, who wrote the book, The New Jim Crow. She recently spoke at my university, and I love how she describes social justice. And she said, social justice is a process, not a destination, right? So keep that in mind. And then also keep in mind that there are very tangible things that we can do to essentially dismantle white supremacy in higher ed. And so I do want to clarify what I mean by white supremacy, because I think oftentimes still even scholars think of images like the KKK, for example. And so I'm going to use the work of Dr. Robin DiAngelo, who, of course, is the author of White Fragility. I will say this, I understand that Dr. DiAngelo has come under some scrutiny with her work for a variety of reasons. But I actually really like how she talks and describes white supremacy. So I'm going to pull up a quote here from her and just read it to you all. So she argues that white supremacy does not refer to individual white people and their individual intentions or actions, but to an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. And then she goes on in the book to say that white supremacy is more than the idea that whites are superior to people of color. It is the deeper premise that supports it's the deeper premise that supports this idea that white people are superior to people of color. The definition of whites acts as the norm or the standard for human, and people of color as a deviation from that norm. So, we can see how whiteness and white supremacy, your white culture, manifests in academia, excuse me. So, for example, Judith Katz, she talks about aspects and assumptions of white culture in the U.S., and she goes on to describe certain facets of that. So if we look at the notion of rugged individualism, this whole notion of self-reliance, but how an extreme form of that can contribute to this feeling that academia is a very isolating place, right? Collaborate, but don't collaborate too much. If we look at what's deemed as professional appearance, some would argue that the way that I look right now, my natural hair, is not professional. Communication, right? So I go back and forth between what we call African American vernacular or English vernacular and the King's English, right? So that is deemed as proper English. So there's no really, space to bring your full self to work and talk about, for example, issues in a way that makes sense to you. And then I'm also wondering about how we approach historical discourses in academia. And what I mean by that is, discourses that privilege the experiences of European immigrants and at the same time presents the genocide of the indigenous folks and the enslavement of Africans as more of an inconvenience rather than a gross injustice, excuse me. And so in order for open education for me to truly do better, we have to continuously work at dismantling whiteness as the main structure in academia. And so we can go ahead and go to the next slide. I think with all of that context, the spirit of open education prides itself on, advocating for inclusive education, which of course I think is incredible. But like any other movement, there are blinders we need to be aware of. And those blinders are placed on us because of our privilege that we all have in some form, in some shape, right? So if you are a US born individual, there are some national privileges that, are given to you, unearned privileges, right? So using a social justice framework that a lot of scholars in open ed have called for us to do really helps us to call out those privileges. But it also helps us to work more productively towards a goal of advocating for an inclusive education, which is so imperative during the COVID-19 time. And I'm wondering whether or not social justice is truly at the core of what we do in open ed. And what I mean by that is it at the core of what we do in theory or in practice, right? I'm reflecting on my own personal experience. Again, I briefly told you all how I first came into this space. I was a part of a grant program, and the way that it was framed, it being OER and open education, was framed as a textbook issue. So if you would have told me 10, 15 years ago that I'd be speaking about, open educational resources and textbooks and how this issue is important to me, I would be like, it's just a textbook, right? But I say all that to say, like, the way that I was introduced to open ed, it was an introduction to a textbook affordability issue and not necessarily a social justice issue. And I've talked to those who typically do talk to other faculty about open education or OER. And I ask them, hey, are you approaching this from a social justice lens? And or are you talking about the intersections between OER and social justice? And the ones who say, no, I'm not doing that, is because they say, well, I don't want open ed or OER to be perceived as too radical. And I always, I kind of smile at that. I don't mean to laugh at that response, but I smile because, again, the basic notion of OERs, the basic notion of open education more broadly, open access, all of that is radical. Given the social structures, the actual structures of academia, given just our structure in general in society. So I wonder, if open ed and OER would have been framed as a social justice issue, I do wonder whether or not if I would have asked the right questions. For example, when I created my open textbook or when I created OER. So that is something, to consider. It's really my belief that in those initial conversations to faculty about OERs and open education, that we need to discuss this from a social justice angle. And so we can go ahead and go to the next slide. All of this leads me to a few more pressing questions, right? And those are, how do we make sure that scholars and sources from marginalized communities are actually better represented in our OERs? How can we actually engage with faculty and educators more about how they can decolonize their curriculum through OERs? And then how can we make sure, in terms of authorship and publishing, that the global north, the US, the UK, Canada, isn't always writing for the global south? So for example, like Africa, or certain countries in Africa, certain countries in Latin America, things of that sort. So to be clear, I do not have the answer to all of these questions, but these are definitely issues that I wrestle with, as my work in open ed deepens further. So it's really not to say that this work isn't already happening, right? There's a lot of scholars who are thinking about these same questions and what does it mean to decolonize open ed. And I do want to take a step back, and I know the term decolonize has been kind of thrown around loosely without understanding what that actually means. So again, I just want to put that out there. But again, this work is being done. It's not to say this work isn't currently going on, but it's rather to call attention to the fact that this work needs to be at the core of what we are doing in open ed, in OER. So I think, the first place that we can start in terms of centering social justice in open education and reckoning with this in open practices is really correcting our historical discourses in this field. And what I mean by that is acknowledging that open ed, or at least the idea behind it, is nothing new. In fact, much of the spirit of open education comes from Indigenous communities and Black feminist thought. And there are other scholars who assert this as well. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about the next scholar that I want to, again, discuss on the next slide. So last year at the 2020 Open Ed conference, Marco Cifrele Valencia, he's an open education librarian at the University of Idaho, and he delivered a really, really, really good talk presentation. It's titled, I think it was OER as Intentionally Engaged Social Justice. I should know this by now because I'm talking more about Marco. And he argued that we have to go in open education. We have to go beyond, textbook course discourses, for example, or textbook discourses, excuse me. And we have to discuss open education from a social justice framework. Although, the literature on this intersection is still kind of limited. I'll go into Sarah Lambert's work a little bit later on. She's one of the scholars who are really thinking about this tension between or the sweet spot, I shouldn't say tension, the sweet spot between open education and social justice. But I think going back to Marco, I think the most exciting part of his presentation was that he was able to connect open education ideologies and practices and the premise of open education to Black feminist thought. And so he specifically argued, and I have a quote here somewhere in my notes, that conventional histories and scholarly contextualizations of open movements do not connect open pedagogy to liberatory women of color feminist proxies and scholarship on education. So in other words, open education ain't nothing new in terms of the ideologies surrounding the role, for example, of the educator in the classroom, surrounding, or interrogating policies and institutional frameworks and procedures in higher ed, and even putting forth questions such as whose knowledge is reliable. The idea of openness, the spirit behind it, is rooted in Black feminist liberation. Yeah, those who are in open education, I know there's like a third of us in the audience that are pretty, well versed in open ed. In terms of defining open education, we know that a lot of that credit and the labor of that credit, or the credit of that labor, is given to white and or cisgender male scholars in open education. And another thing to consider is that it is these, mostly white men who are considered thought leaders in open ed. Although I am very hopeful that, we're actually in an interesting moment in open ed, that I think this is beginning to change, to widen the notion of who is a thought leader. But what is to be said about open education when we can trace its practices and ideologies beyond current thought leaders, right? It's truly not to discount their labor, and that's not what I'm trying to do, but rather it's to call attention to the ease that we have in assigning authoritative knowledge to white men, for example, without considering the immense contributions of BIPOC folks. And so much of that, or much of what we know as open education, has been talked about in great detail and is beautifully demonstrated in the labor of scholars of color, particularly women of color. So I think this is one small but powerful way that we can center social justice and open education by correcting our historical narratives about this movement. And again, as Marco says in this quote on the slide, the foundational works of Black feminist scholars like Bell Hooks and Regina Austin are both intellectual foremothers to many concepts in contemporary open practice. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see how, for example, there are manifestations of Black feminism, in open education. So this quote from Bell Hooks, which happens to be kind of an anchor point, if you will, my teaching philosophy, where she talks about the transgressions in the transgressing boundaries, in the classroom, and how, the classroom really is a dynamic place of radical transformation. Well, this same ideology that's put forth by Bell Hooks in this book, Teaching to Transgress, or her essay, Teaching to Transgress, it manifests in some of our open practices. So if we look at, for example, open pedagogy, and that of course is the practice of engaging with students as creators of information through OER and other open practices, rather than just, again, knowledge buckets and consumers of information, we see that connection here. In other words, the transgression of boundaries that Bell Hooks speaks of. And so we also see this influence of Black feminism in another popular idea in open education, that being renewable versus, disposable assignments. So disposable assignments are those traditional assignments that many of us, give as educators, like exams. They're very transactional. Students might study for the exam and they forget all the content after the exam is done. Whereas renewable is more of this co-creation process. There could be a real world audience involved. It's not as transactional. It's supposed to be, again, just to use the actual term and the definition, renewable and communal in its practices. And we do that through leveraging OERs. So both of these notions, open pedagogy and renewable versus disposable assignment, and I understand the two kind of blur into each other. We can see how there is somewhat of a Black feminist influence in some of these practices. Both seek to Black feminism, for example, in the classroom, and open education, open pedagogy seek to challenge the role of educators and students, as well as the utility of certain assignments. So just to kind of wrap up this part of my talk, I'm arguing that these ideas are not new and that we need to acknowledge that instead of packaging open education in whiteness and white saviorhood. We have scholars of color to thank for already doing this work and continuing to do this work. And again, I really, really, really appreciate Marco's attempt in reframing this narrative that we have in open education. He does have a new article out. And again, just referring back to my notes here, it's called It's Not Just About Cost, Academic Libraries and Intentionally Engaged OER for Social Justice. Again, that was It's Not Just About Cost, Academic Libraries and Intentionally Engaged OER for Social Justice. And he talks more about this connection between Black feminism and open education. So Marco's work, as well as, the next part of my talk, builds on the wonderful work from Sarah Lambert. And she's a scholar out of Australia. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Some of her work, really closely examines how inclusive is open education. And she's asking some really, really good questions in her work. She continues to do so. So she's trying to figure out, and these are her own words, how much does open education truly serve the underserved and the underprivileged? And so a couple of years ago, I think it's now been 3 years, I can't remember off the top of my head, she conducted this very interesting critical analysis titled View of Changing Our Discourse, a Distinctive Social Justice Aligned Definition of Open Education. We'll put that in the chat for you all. But in that critical analysis, she examined about 19 to 20 papers, I think it was. And those papers, really shaping the conversation about social justice and open education. And so she uses literature from scholars about, social justice and what have you. And from that literature, she comes up with 3 principles of social justice that will inform open education. And those 3 social justice principles are redistributive justice, recognitive, and representational justice. And so I really, really like how Sarah interrogates the challenges of defining something as open if we are charged to use this social justice angle. And so in her paper, just to pull up a quote from her paper, she's asking how open is the textbook for marginalized learners if Indigenous, Hispanic, and learners of color are invisible inside the textbook and perhaps invisible in the whole curriculum. Then she goes on to say the editing of such a textbook to include images in cases featuring more diverse communities, businesses, and people will be an act of recognitive justice. But, goes on to say, what if the textbook features people of color, but does not value their perspectives, does not value their knowledges or histories? What if the textbook takes a white colonial view of Black lives if Black stories are told solely by white voices? So she goes on to say the development of or selection of a new version of a textbook, or perhaps a new resource altogether, written by people of color, where they are free to represent their own views, histories, and knowledges, would be an act of representational justice. So again, you can see here in open education conversations, we tend to focus a great deal on redistributive justice. So, access to materials, economic justice, things of that sort. And but I also want to delve into the notion of how we can realize recognitive justice and representational justice by interrogating whose stories get to be told and who gets the privilege of telling those stories. And so starting first with recognitive justice, as I talked about earlier in my talk, I'm curious about the implications that come from assigning certain course materials and the decisions, right, that professors make in their course in terms of course materials. I think the implications of this points to issues of who gets to have a voice and who does not. And this can have a profound impact on our students. And I know because I was one of those students who had that experience where I didn't really feel like my history, my people's history was reflected at any point in time in the curriculum, unless I took like an African American studies course in college, for example. So focusing on recognitive and redistributive justice helps faculty and students bring their lived experiences into the classroom, into the content. And as a result, it acknowledges that, their lived experiences and their knowledge is valuable and reliable. And this can have, again, particularly profound and powerful effects on students, but particularly students who are coming from marginalized communities, where unfortunately there is a devaluation, of these lived experiences and their knowledge in the curriculum. And this actually reminds me of a talk that Siko, and I never can pronounce Siko's last name correctly. One of these days I'm going to get it correctly, but I'm just going to say Siko. She delivered a talk almost 4 years ago at OpenCon 2017, I think it was, where she critiqued the overrepresentation of authorship from the white Western perspective. And on the next slide, there's a quote that she gave during her talk, which was so profound. She said that, cisgender white men from Western countries make up only 20% of the global population. When she said that, y'all, I was like, for some reason, I thought it was a lot more. I really did. But cisgender white men only make up 20% to 25% of the global population, yet they are writing for 80% of the world. So, let's not repeat this same statistic in our open educational resources, in our open practices. It's disappointing for students to not see their histories and their heritage reflected in the curriculum. Not to mention everyone, all students, are negatively affected in these exclusionary situations. We can't, I know with everything that has happened in the past year in 2020 and the summer 2020 in particular, a lot of institutions have created renewed commitments to inclusion, equity, and diversity. But we can't just tout diversity in lived experiences and numbers at universities, right? How can professors and administrators truly say that they want to enhance the retention of, for example, students of color, but not create conditions for them to thrive in, for example, creating or including a diverse curriculum? We have to put a halt to this DEI theater, if you will. So there are some BIPOC scholars who are doing this hard work in correcting DEI theater and not centering social justice. And I want to go ahead and move on to the next slide and show you all a few scholars who are doing work. So Doctors Gloria Snively and Lorna Williams out of Canada created an open textbook bringing Indigenous science into the fold with Western science. And I really, really, really love this because we constantly make the assumption that Western science is the safest or the most reliable science, medicine in the world. Yet, if we look at the healthcare experiences of BIPOC folks in the West in particular, and again, the history of BIPOC folks in the healthcare medical realm, it paints a very, very different story. But the authors of this textbook, just reading this quote on the slide there, they said, when we braid Indigenous science with Western science, we acknowledge that both ways of knowing are legitimate forms of knowledge. This is socially just open education. So on my next slide, I want to talk about how we can put some of this into action, right? Because again, I talk a lot about okay, how can we actually practice some of this in very practical, minor ways? And I'm so sorry that bottom line, the slide there, you can't see it. But even outside of open education, let's take a look at our syllabi, right? And are we using inclusive language? Are we using inclusive content? Are we making our syllabi openly available? You'd be surprised how many faculty are scared to share their syllabi. I mean, seriously, I've been there before. and I think it comes a lot from the culture in academia, where we're ranked, we're rated, competition is high, and even something as benign as sharing a syllabus can cause a lot of fear, can cause a lot of negative emotions. So encouraging folks to make this openly available and using inclusive language in your syllabus, making sure that you're not just including scholars from a particular one area or one background, for example. You diversify the scholars that you are including in your syllabus. One thing that I've done more recently since the pandemic started is I've done a lot of co-creation with my students. And the reason why I did this is because I knew engagement would be a struggle for them, because again, they're going through some of the same issues, if not other issues, than faculty are experiencing. And so again, I wanted to enhance the engagement in my classroom. And I think one easy way to do that is by inviting students into that creation process. So I had students co-create assignments with me, like choose what kind of assignments they would want to complete for the class. I had my students create the attendance policy during the global pandemic because they know what's best for them. And to be honest with you, they're very reasonable. It's not a situation where they're like, oh, we're going to miss 3/4 of class and expect to do well. They want to be in class. In fact, class has been maybe a source of relief given what some of them are going through. And also in terms of, if we're talking about open pedagogy, I know there are some textbook projects where students are helping faculty to create this. Now, I do have below that point that you should be kind of aware that there are some issues or ethical issues to consider. So we don't want to engage in the exploitation of student labor, of course. We also want to make sure if we're inviting students into that creation process, that we're not just inviting students who typically come from those identities or those experiences or the background that are already centered, that we are really being intentional about inviting those students whose history and knowledge is not typically centered in the curriculum or in the classroom. And so another easy way that you can engage in some form of equity or inclusion or social justice in your classroom is doing something that I actually, a tip that I got from a conference at my university, and that is Scholar of the Week, right? So showing a picture of a scholar who comes from, or shares some type of similar background as your students, not just citing white male scholars or white scholars or male scholars, right? Making sure that you're highlighting the scholars of various different backgrounds in your curriculum. So these are just some ways that we can put, and again, very minor practical ways that we can put some of this into action. So next slide. And then another way that we can put this into action, going back to the syllabus, is if we're saying that we are, about social justice in our classroom, and we want to try to, center social justice in our classroom, we have to kind of look at our learning objectives, right? Is that actually communicated in your syllabus? Is that communicated in your open textbook in the OER? So for example, I had to do this in my class. So I teach 2 courses. One is a campaign class and the other one is a writing class, specifically for those students who want to go into public relations and journalism. And so the first statement that you see there, it's not a bad learning objective, in terms of, what I've learned in some of my course redesign institutes. It's a fine objective statement, but it says nothing, or I'm sorry, learning objective statement, but it says nothing about social justice, right? And so the last 2 objective statements really speak to, social justice and how I'm framing it and discussing it in the classroom, and how I want my students to be thinking about these traditions, policies, and procedures and systems of power, if you will. So that's another way that we can engage in this type of work. Very, very practical, minor way of doing that. Next slide. So I want to go ahead and go into the last part of my talk. So this entire hour or so, I've been advocating for social justice and open, and anti-racism and open, for that to be the core, right, of our work. But we have to make sure that we're doing this with care. We have to make sure that we're doing this intentionally, strategically, and awareness of whether open is actually culturally appropriate. So referring back to the 2020 Open Education Conference, one of the amazing keynotes there was Jessie Lawyer, and she's a librarian, I think, out of Mount Royal University in Canada. But she delivered a really, really thought-provoking keynote and argued the push towards openness sometimes means that we're missing like cultural context in that there are things that shouldn't be open. So, for example, Jesse says, open access and indigenous thought and assertions about information can emerge from a similar impulse. That's the word or the phrase that she's using there. And that similar impulse is the idea that something is being withheld from us. But there are important differences to consider. So open access, for example, argues, for the most part, open is unlimited, should be open to everyone. Indigenous thought argues that open is for those who are the rightful authors or, inheritors of that information. So Jesse goes on to assert that we need Indigenous, consultation when referring to open access and open education, specifically for Indigenous information. If we want to use open ed and OER as a tool to serve Indigenous sovereignty, for example. And she also argues to let Indigenous people decide what happens to their information. So I'm wondering, in what ways can we apply this same cultural competence to other marginalized communities when we're trying to leverage open ed in the name of, engaging in socially just labor or engaging in equity, for example. And we also have to consider the differing risk of doing this work in open education, depending upon who's doing this work. And that leads me to my next slide. So particularly scholars of color who are often charged to do social justice labor and work, anti-racism work, whether that's because they're volunteering to do it, because it's out of a place of survival, right? Or they're assumed that this is their value to the academy. They are at a particular risk when they're engaging in open work. So there's an increasing amount of faculty members of color who are aggressively attacked for simply doing their work, for calling out the very systems that breed inequity and discrimination. That happened to me last year when I wrote that Why Academia Do Better article. I cannot tell you the amount of emails I received from people, not death threats, but pretty unnerving emails that I receive from some individuals. So Dr. Stephen Finley, Biko Gray, and Lori Martin recently authored an article called Affirming Our Values. And in that article, they discuss the particular vulnerability that faculty of color face in doing this type of work, especially if they're researching issues related to social justice or race or gender, things of that sort. And so, I can also share in this experience. I really revamped a lot of my classes content so that it would reflect this social justice framework that I'm really trying to be intentional about in my class. And for the most part, it went over really well. Thank God. But there were some students on my student evaluations at the end of the semester who said, she's trying to force this liberal education on us, liberal meaning politically liberal, right? Flaming liberal, like all those stereotypes, right? And they basically accused me of being too political in the classroom. And my argument to that, and I've heard that a lot in light of educators who are trying to use or incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice at the core of their classroom curriculum. My response to those who are uncomfortable with that is that politics is at the core of almost every single educational practice and decision made in the classroom and outside of the classroom. In terms of who is valued, right? For example, whose histories get to be told and why we have made that decision. So, there has to be more institutional support and infrastructure around protecting scholars who are doing or trying to do this hard work. And again, this is already a particularly vulnerable population. And to not protect them while they're doing this important work, in my opinion, is an act of disrespect, devaluing this work, and gross negligence. So let's keep that in mind when we deliver an ask of certain groups. So now I'm towards the end, the very, very end of my talk, my last slide. I feel like I've just really talked at you all, so I'm eager to get into more of a discussion. But just to kind of wrap this up, our commitment in open education is so important. And it's even more important during this time. We can't buy into the idea that our work needs to wait at a more appropriate time when there's more funding, when this whole DEI thing dies down, which it won't. But, I've heard some of those things anecdotally. We can't wait. This is the most perfect time to do this work. Because of the pandemic, students and faculty feel a loss of identity, right? And I'm thinking about the ways in which we can leverage open education OER to address this. So, traditional academic culture, protects this closed way of doing research and learning and all of that, whereas open education is supposed to promote this sharing, of information and disruption of boundaries that permit inequities. And so this alone speaks to why we have to continue to do this work. The historically marginalized are even more at the margins because of this pandemic. It has really exacerbated systemic discrimination and oppression. And so those in open education, we have to remain steadfast. We really, really have to remain steadfast in our work, and steadfast in the mission to center social justice. There's a lot of things going on in this world. There's a lot of trauma going on. We are all sharing in some form, shape, or form in collective trauma. And so there's a lot of healing to do. And I really believe that open education, one that's firmly rooted in social justice, can be used in that path towards healing. So that is all I have for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you so, so much. And I'll go ahead and open it up for a discussion for the last 20 minutes or so.
Dr. Roberts, the main question we've gotten so far is, how do you define librarians in your poll of sometimes they're not faculty, sometimes they're not staff? Where do you see them at the intersection of this work?
That's a really great question, because I apologize. I did not thoughtfully think about that. I have been privy to some of these discussions about, are librarian staff, are they faculty? I don't like it when librarians are put into this supportive, almost subordinate role in academia. Absolutely not. I see, depending upon, of course, institution and what have you, I see that there's a lot of intersection between how academia defines staff and how academia defines faculty. But I really see it, existing in both spaces. But that's a great question, because I unfortunately did not intentionally think about what that would mean, right, when I include librarians in the poll. So thank you so much. Was that Cheryl? Thank you so much for bringing that to my attention.
Another question, well, it's really my question. I didn't see anyone else come in with it. Is that you talked about creating content with your students and creating rules. And have you thought about how you might create actual an OER packet or an OER course reading selection with your students, having them, working together as a team to create something that is OER related that could be available to anyone?
Yeah, I have thought about that, and I've attempted to do that previous semesters. And to be quite honest with you, it has been challenging. I'm going to do it again this semester. It's been challenging on a lot of fronts. So it's been challenging because there has to be some buy-in from um, people within my institution, right? Because I don't want to send the message that I am exploiting my students. That's the furthest thing that I am trying to do here. So there's a little bit of that tension in terms of being clear about what I mean by using students to create assignments, for example, or to create, to your point, open textbooks or open material. What I have done in the past is, for example, when I was teaching in person, I would have what are called news discussions. They're basically current events discussions where students could, talk about, news topics, anything that was being covered in the news and how that connects to our classroom material. And there were several times where I felt like students did a very, very good job of connecting, real world examples to some of the material that we were discussing in class. And so if I felt like students were making those connections in a very meaningful way, I would pull aside that student and ask if, for example, they would feel comfortable writing a two to three paragraph paper explaining that example so that I can use it in the open textbook, and I would, credit them, of course. And so many students actually really, really, really liked that, because in a way I affirmed that their knowledge was just as valuable and just as useful as the knowledge that I am, bringing into the classroom. And so I think the important point here is to emphasize agency and autonomy with students. We can't force students to engage in open pedagogy or co-creation of open textbooks, because I think that's when it gets into that, question of ethics. So I see here in the chat that Cynthia said that one of their professors creates a law review with her undergraduate students with the compilation of her student papers. Yes, I've heard similar examples of that as well. And then Jean wrote here that they're creating an OER textbook now. Okay, yeah. I think that's probably the easiest way to go about it, to see if students are willing to either do something for extra credit or explain, right? Be very transparent with students. What are you using their papers, their information for, right? And do not force them to openly license their work, because depending upon what they're sharing, what they're writing about, they might not want to share that, right? They might not want to openly license that. And I said that in my talk as well, in terms of open might not be culturally appropriate for everything. So I think just remembering that. I'm not sure if that answered your question completely. Sometimes I can be a little long-winded, but to answer your question in a nutshell, I have done that, and I've done that in the form of like extra credit or things of that sort, or to, I think it was Cynthia's point, using some student papers, like very, very brief papers to help enhance the textbook. And I do credit them, I do cite them. I try not to do it too much, only because of that tension that I think exists in institutions, in terms of, I don't want to send the wrong message to my colleagues in my department or anything like that. And I'm currently thinking about ways in which I can address that while still furthering open pedagogy, this co-creation of materials with my students.
Thank you for that. Another question's come in. Commercial publishers have responded by increasing UDL and accessibility and cultural relevance in their products. At a policy level, society is moving towards free college. Will OER, specifically not open pedagogy, lose relevance as we make progress in social justice and commercial publishing and education funding?
I don't think it will. If anything, it'll become more relevant. If I'm understanding the question correctly, my hope is that in increasing the demand for more accessible materials, more inclusive materials, more open materials, in terms of however we're operationalizing open, that will in turn become the default, right? The way that we're doing things now becomes the, wait, why are we doing it that way? So I'm not sure if we will still use the term open education or OER. I know there's some like debate about that. But again, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I'm thinking that it would in turn kind of become the default of how we engage in course materials and things of that sort. And I think one thing to keep in mind with, commercial or traditional textbook publishers, um, one big piece that I'm seeing that probably addresses this person's question better is that yes, we are seeing you know, traditional commercial publishers trying to be more inclusive. My question to that is always like, inclusive to what? And I actually have to credit one of my colleagues, um, who also is asking that question. Like when we talk about inclusion or inclusive learning, inclusive materials, like what do we really mean by that? But anyways, so yes, I understand that traditional commercial textbook publishers, that's a mouthful, are trying to make some progress. And I, just referencing my own personal experience, the knock, knock, knock at the door from the publisher. I recall a specific experience where my colleague right next door to me, she had a visit from a publisher, and I was being nosy, to be honest with you. I was trying to listen in on their conversation, and I noticed that what this person was doing, they were just trying to market convenience to faculty. They weren't trying to make her a better educator. And so I don't know, maybe it's because I'm knee deep in this, but I think open education is truly here to make faculty be better educators and not just making this job more convenient. So I don't think that OER or open education will be dead, for lack of better words, because of that goal, right? To make faculty, to make educators better educators. And I'm not sure if I see that as much in the commercial publishing industry.
Great. Thank you for that. Now we're going to switch gears completely here. So can you tell us, what are your thoughts on bringing these social justice values into college with a very homogeneous and non-diverse population? Or how do you respond in class to criticism about being, quote, too liberal, unquote?
Well, that's a good question. There are a couple of things with that. So I know I talked a lot about racial and even gender justice in my talk, but I almost kind of want to contradict myself a little bit in saying that I think if we flatten this notion of like diversity, we are really setting ourselves up for a very superficial conversation about diversity and what that means. So, in other words, when we only look at diversity in terms of racial diversity or gender diversity, that I think that makes people nervous about like, oh, well, I shouldn't, or I don't feel the need to engage in this type of work because most of my students are white students, for example. But that's not the only lens of diversity, even though that is an important one, because race is, even though it's a social construct, it is particularly consequential in the US in terms of the livelihood of individuals and our lived experiences. But anywho, getting to the point, I think one has to kind of interrogate what they mean by lack of diversity. If it's racial diversity, I understand that. And that is something that I've even thought about as a Black woman, right? Engaging in social justice frameworks in labor to predominantly white students. I'm at Ohio State. It's a PWI, predominantly white institution. What does that mean for me as an educator of color? What does that mean for my white students as well when I'm talking about these issues? So yeah, I would encourage that individual to maybe reframe how they're coming into this conversation about diversity. And if that person is, we're looking at racial diversity in particular, if that person is white, for example, I would say it's even more imperative that you try to do this work, because let me tell you, it's going to be a lot more meaningful coming from you than it is from me, because students are going to assume that I'm being biased, that I'm being too liberal because I'm a Black woman. I'm a queer Black woman at that. But because of how our society is in this country, when social justice labor comes from an individual who honestly benefits from oppressive systems, and yet they're critiquing it, that message is more, I don't want to take away from the power of my work. So I'm being very careful with my words here, but that message tends to resonate more. And I'm thinking of this theory called expectancy violation theory, where people make assumptions about the stance that you're going to take or the message that you're going to deliver, depending upon your identity, right? So, for example, because I am a cisgender woman, you might assume that I'm feminist, or I at least believe in some feminist ideologies. But if I come up here and denounce feminism and I talk about how horrible it is, that actually might pique your interest, and my message might be more meaningful, or at least resonate more with people. But that's a long way to answer to say that, you know, really try to reimagine this notion of diversity. I think that's something that I've been particularly critical of when I hear terms like diverse students. Well, white people can be diverse. If we're looking at other realms of diversity outside of racial diversity, there's so much more to that. So there's that. And then the whole liberal, comment. Oh my gosh, I'm getting that so much often. And I don't care. Because what I do care about at the end of the day is that, again, like I was saying earlier, students and faculty sometimes don't realize that politics, and I'm not thinking about it in terms of like the traditional US politics, but in terms of whose values, whose beliefs, whose histories get to be centered, that is a part of the curriculum process, right? What is deemed as seminal text in our disciplines? There's politics behind that, right? So that's how I respond to that. I just tell students, like, whether or not you realize it, someone's politics are being centered in the classroom. And for too long and too often, it has been the politics of cisgender white men. Okay. And if that, uh, brings up some negative feelings from students, I'm not saying too bad, because we do have to walk them through that. But I would engage in some what we call motivated interviewing. Really ask questions as to why, being more inclusive, being more equitable is such a threat, to certain individuals, or perceived threat, for example. But yeah, I just encourage students to take a step back and to really realize that someone's politics is almost always at the center of the classroom. There are very few things in the classroom that don't involve someone's politics, someone's histories, someone's knowledge being centered. And as a result, someone else's knowledge, histories, and politics marginalized, excuse me.
We have another question that came in. Starts with a comment first, though. It's too bad that we just transpose text and pictures onto a computer when making OER.
Yeah.
We don't include interactivity of the kind that computers really can offer us these days. So, at what point do you think that this might change, where OER might become a little bit more interactive rather than just sort of text and picture based?
Yeah, I think that change is coming. And I can't speak to, because like the OER open education landscape looks so different, even in the US, but outside of the US, it looks very different depending upon the educational infrastructure that is at play. Um, I think it will come soon. And the reason why I say that is because I'm hearing more students and faculty kind of addressing some of these issues. And if we're, thinking about OER and open education and the fact that it emphasizes faculty and student autonomy, I'm actually thinking that, this is going to come from the community, right? The more interactive OERs, instead of the ones that are just text and pictures. I'm thinking of, I just recently spoke at Salt Lake Community College a few weeks ago, and there was this faculty member there that was kind of concerned that his OER would not be considered OER because it didn't have enough text, right? So he's created an OER for one of his labs, and I think he teaches biology, I want to say. I know it's a science field, but he was really concerned, and I think that gets to this point, the fact that OERs are not just, like this person said, transposing text and pictures. What he's creating a more interactive video-based OER, it can be OER. And so I am hoping, like, I think it was Chris's point, that does change. And the reason why I'm very hopeful for that is because I think it's going to come from the community, from faculty who will create this, from students who will, bring these ideas to the forefront in the classroom. So yes, absolutely. I agree with that, Chris. I really, really agree with that. And I've been thinking about that more in my own open textbook as I'm thinking about updating it and how I can make it more interactive and not just picture, text, because students are over that. Good point.
That's all the questions that we have so far. Folks, there's still time. Please chime in if you have them. Okay.
I mean, if they don't, that's okay.
No.
I mean, I've really enjoyed my time here. I mean, I'm happy to still stick around, but I just want to acknowledge that this is tough work, right? But it's work worth doing, and there are very, very, very easy ways that we can engage in this work, and then there's labor that's going to take a lot more time, a lot more intentionality. And what I tell people is that this has to be a career-long commitment. Even for someone like myself, even though I'm speaking about social justice, you would think probably my class is the most socially just class. And that may or may not be the case. I'm constantly working at these issues. There's never, again, reiterating that quote about social justice is a process and not a destination. There will never be a point in my career, in my life, because this truly is my life passion, where I'm like, okay, I've checked the social justice inclusion box. I've reached a point where it's the most socially just classroom in the nation. I'm done, right? This is a commitment that I've made. This is important to me as a scholar and educator. And I think in order to do this work correctly, you have to kind of make that commitment for you as an educator and a scholar.
Well, we thank you so much for this really illuminating talk. I know I have personally enjoyed it. I'm going to give everyone, all attendees, just a couple of logistical things real quickly. Please provide your feedback on this session on the survey that will pop up when you leave the session. The next session is tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. There are 2 sessions that are happening. So during this break, which is a little bit of a long break, we encourage you to check out the meeting hub and connect with other attendees. To leave this session, you can click the back to timeline link on the top left-hand corner of the portal. And we really thank you all for being here today. We thank Professor Roberts for being here today. This is a wonderful talk. And yeah, I'm excited. So thank you.
Thank you all.